Arabian Winds by Linda Chaikin. I did not record chapter 7, in which Leia is discovered with a head injury, dead in the desert. So now we're on to chapter 8. The hut was wrapped in silence when Allison entered. Memories reached out to grab her as Leia seemed to fill the room with her presence. No, Leia is dead. She didn't know the Lord. I failed her. Allison castigated herself. She stood in the grip of loss, but her feelings of spiritual failure went even deeper to cut across her soul. Whether her sense of guilt was from God or her own emotions at the moment didn't matter, for it hurt too deeply to ignore. It's my fault, she bit her trembling lip. I should have tried harder to help her. How many times did I pray for Leia? Not enough, never enough. I should have spoken more plainly about who Jesus is and why he came, but I didn't. And even when I had the opportunity, when she asked me about my life, I drew back, almost afraid to tell her she needed him for fear she would think I was preaching at her. Oh, that I had. I've been willing to work with Aunt Lydia on the mercy, to give myself to the Fahalan, but what have I done for my own family? Now it's too late for Leia, forever too late. Tears streamed down her face. The wind was rising and rattling the window, and she heard the familiar sound of sand scattering across the roof. She imagined Leia's body stiff and cold in the medical hut. Oh, Lord, help me. She buried her face in her hands and sank to the rumpled bed. After a minute, she was able to control herself with considerable effort. Wiping her eyes and finding a handkerchief to blow her nose, she swallowed hard and went to the small bureau. David would be waiting, and it was risky to keep him there by the motor car. One of the Turkish inspectors might see him and stop him. She must hurry. Opening the drawers, she began to pack her things hazardly, then stopped. She stood still, staring down at her drawer. Someone had been searching through her clothing. At first annoyed, she thought of the officials. It was rather silly of them to scatter her undergarments about so carelessly. They could at least have been gentlemen enough to leave them alone. Then an unpleasant thought slithered across her mind. Was it the officials, or was there some other less pleasant explanation? But who would have searched, and why? Her heart beat faster. Leia had left last night, and they had found her this afternoon. How long had she been dead? The doctor had suggested the accident had taken place this morning. Then someone had had the opportunity to search Allison's hut before they had ridden the camels to the Roman site. She tried to remember what she had done that morning. She had overslept and was awakened by Sarah's banging on the door. David had been with her, and Helga Kruger. Helga had announced the inspectors were coming. Then what? Allison had gone on to Jamal's lecture, then a brief lunch, and the ride to the digs, where they had found Leia's body. Who would have had time to search her hut, and why? A hopeful yet frightening thought came to mind. What if the murderer hadn't found the book with Leia? What if she had only taken the decoy papers? The red herring, as Leia had called them. Was it possible that Leia had been more suspicious than she had let on? Had she taken the book she had found in Major Reuter's hut? Allison realized she had never seen it, not even when Leia packed the kit bag to leave for her second meeting with Neil, or the person pretending to be Neil. The enemy had killed her, but he had not found what he was looking for. Then, thought Allison with a tingle, someone came back here to look for it. The question was, did he find it? She searched the hut thoroughly, thinking Leia may have left her something, but Allison found nothing. It could mean the enemy had found the book, or Leia hadn't hidden it in the hut, since there was little opportunity to place it elsewhere. Allison dismally decided the enemy had found it. A rap on the outer wall facing the front of the compound made her jump. David's voice sounded through the thin wooden walls. Allison! Coming! The stars gleamed in brilliant silver when, with her bag packed and carrying her kit bag, Allison hurried across the grounds, past the wooden buildings that lay scattered like dark mounds to the open-top car. David slid anxiously behind the wheel. Where are the keys? She handed them to him. Not a word more was spoken as the engine started, and they made a half circle, sending up a shower of gritty sand. David turned on to the narrow dirt road built for camels, donkeys, and wagons. Soon they were driving north toward Durabalus, 90 miles ahead. Despite the earlier warnings about bad weather, the night was awe-inspiring. Relinquishing her grief and fears to the warm Arabian wind, Allison leaned back against the seat beside David, her eyes on the heavily wash of stars that spilled across the desert sky. With holy abandon, she gathered courage from the one who held all in his hand, from a tiny sparrow to the limitless universe, and yes, even Leia's inopportune death. This one is for my father, she consoled herself. What have I to fear? No matter what may happen to me, nothing in all this world or in the spiritual realm can bring me to ruin. While danger and turmoil are all about me, it's also true a heavenly hedge surrounds, and nothing can get through to harm me unless my father allows it. And if he does, I can still trust him with it. He will in the end see that it all worked for my eternal good. David turned his head and glanced at her. Are you all right? About Leia, I mean. Not yet, but I'll make it. It was a rotten thing to happen. She was with you all the time, wasn't she, in the hut? She looked at his profile, strong in the starlight. The wind was tossing his chestnut, wavy hair beneath his hat. Yes, how did you know? He shrugged his heavy shoulders. I figured it out easily enough. I think some of the others knew, too. The Baroness, for one, and maybe Jamal. Allison wondered. Perhaps she had suspected Helga knew. They drove in silence for a few minutes, and David said lightly, like Moses in the wilderness, I hope you know the direction we're supposed to be headed. This wilderness looks all the same to me. And in the night, it might as well be no man's land. At least we have a full tank, I checked. She had spare petrol tins in the back. I brought some food and canteens of water, too, just in case. I drove this route last year, said Allison. I have a map if we need it and a torch. Her voice carried in the wind, and she added with more cheerfulness than she felt. Follow that star. The star gave way to a dawn sky, as the car bumped and jostled along the sandy road. Ahead, the road gets worse, said Allison. You'll need to slow down. Oh, wonderful, complained David good-naturedly. Now you tell me. My dear girl, we're already creeping. I should have brought my motorbike. We usually use camels and donkeys, she smiled. Stars of flaring lavender, gold, red, and green turned the expanse into the breathtaking beauty of a sterile flower garden. It was this that she loved about the Arabian desert. Even though the wilderness had the hostile potential to kill those who were unprepared for its rigors, its beauty overwhelmed her. Where fog and clouds held London skies to periods of gloom, the desert was wide awake, throbbing with color and glory. Allison removed her scarf and let her long, flame-colored hair ripple like a banner of shining silk. Her green eyes sparkled beneath dark lashes with the tension of the past days, the death of Leia, and the dreadful thought of what may lay before them showed in pale smudges of shadow beneath her eyes. She yawned and reached below the floorboard for one of the several canteens of water. As the yet cool water came to her tongue, she froze, refusing to swallow. Suddenly, the dawn's garden of color and beauty was invaded by the hideous face of a serpent of evil. She leaned over, gripping the door, and managed to spit out the mouthful. The horrid, bitter taste clung to her tongue and smarted her eyes. What is it? Cried David as Allison choked. He brought the car to a rattling halt. The water tastes like it's been poisoned. Poisoned? He grabbed the canteen and whiffed it, wetting his finger and touching it to his tongue. You're right. The wind buffeted the car's side and gave a powerful tug, as if to turn it over. The silence in the great expanse of land uninhabited except for the bands of Bedouins, vipers, and wind spiders imprisoned them. I felt them myself, he said with a note of anger. He gathered the others from the floorboard to sample them. Then he frowned a moment later as he looked at her. They've all been tampered with. But who could have done it, and why? Breathed Allison. She was not a known agent, nor did she have any strategic information. The reason seems clear to me, grumbled David. Someone is trying to frighten you or both of us. There was no chance we would drink this stuff once we tasted it. What I want to know is how it was managed when I filled them myself and brought them to the car. They were never out of my sight. Are you certain of it? As certain as I can be. I waited to fill them until after dark, and I made sure no one was around. Someone was, said Allison, and looked at him. His brown eyes, sparkling with anger, turned reflective. All right, I want to know what's going on with you. So far, I think I've been pretty patient, sneaking about in the dead of night, helping you slip away unseen. From what? From who? Leia is dead, Neil is missing, and now this? Allison was haunted by her own thoughts and didn't respond. David was right. Someone had known Leia was hiding in her hut all along. Someone, undoubtedly the one who had murdered Carl Reuter, had outguessed her plans to drive to the expedition hut at Durabolis. Someone didn't want her to reach Neil and Leia's house and had wanted to frighten her to keep her away. We'll turn back then, said David, frowning. We can't risk going on without a water supply. Allison felt the back of her neck prickle. She glanced at David, studying the square jawline. No, she thought breathlessly, the enemy could not be David. I'll stake my life on it. She realized with an uncomfortable start that she had already done so. They were alone in the Arabian desert. As David had admitted, it would have been impossible for anyone to poison the canteen's water without his awareness. Then how and who? Or rather, was the question why? Did his political aspirations to establish a Jewish homeland cause him to look to the German Empire for their fulfillment? Was it the Kaiser and not England that he felt offered the best help? Allison remembered reading something in the Cairo paper recently. It had only been a paragraph, but it had caught her attention because her own sympathies were with Jerusalem. The paper had said that within Russia and Germany, secret overtures were being made to gain Jewish support should war break out. In return, vague promises had been made about some sort of Jewish independence in Palestine. As yet, as far as she knew, no such comments had been forthcoming from either England or America. She watched David's strong hands on the wheel, the firm grip that spoke of a personality that was determined on its course, wherever it led. In some sense, she couldn't blame him. If she were Jewish, she too would fight any political battle to establish a state of their own in the land that God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I won't go back, she said quietly but evenly. I owe this to two people I cared about deeply. You might end up like Leia. His eyes were masked. We both might. Say, now, you don't think I did this? He threw the canteen down angrily. Allison remained silent and looked at him. He glowered. A fine thanks I get for befriending you. He vigorously turned the key to start the engine. I didn't accuse you. Don't be silly. If you were the enemy, it's too late anyway, isn't it? What do you mean? I mean, you could put a gun in my head this moment and no one would hear the shot. He muttered something and leaned back in his seat, shutting his eyes. To think I'm falling in love with you, and you'd think I'd... Please don't say that, she whispered. Don't say what, he grumbled, starting the motor again. What you just said about falling for me. He looked at her frustrated. Would it be so unthinkable, so terrible? I know I'm Jewish, but it isn't that, and you know it. You know one of the reasons. Oh, yes, you are, shall I say the forbidden word, a Christian, and I'm... She specifically placed a hand on his arm, her eyes pleading. Not now, David, please, let's go on. There's a Bedouin well ahead. And there's the missionary, Wade Finley. Yes, I know. They drove on in silence. Do you know where this oasis well is? She relaxed when he changed the subject, but felt grieved he could be falling for her. He didn't mean it, she thought. It was all this death and tension. It made some people behave more emotionally than they would otherwise. The idea of death quickened the soul to grab for a relationship, even if it wasn't real. She must stay clear of involvement and keep a cool head. In a weak moment, she looked at him, saw his hair ruffling under the hat, and felt a tenderness she could not explain and wanted to avoid. The well's not far ahead. We stopped there last year. We'll be there by noon. Getting water was not the frightening issue. It was the vulnerability she felt. Someone had poisoned the canteens beneath David's watchful care. Well, said David wearily, I see you're still wishing to keep me in the dark about what's going on, I mean. He looked over at her. At least we have the bag of oranges. Allison watched the sunrise as it lit up the distant hills. By mid-morning, the heat covered everything, and the sky faded to a monotonous blue. Monotonous. Okay, I had it right the first time. It was after the sun was center sky and had begun its descent that they reached the oasis. Later than Allison had thought. They gazed at a desert heaven green with shade, cool well water, and date palms. The dates could be eaten freely, but the law of the desert forbid any to be carried away. A Bedouin shepherdess in black kept a flock of rangy goats and ignored Alice and David as if they were a mirage. Flies buzzed. The temperature climbed. While David checked the engine and added the spare tins of petrol, she thought, there isn't a vicious bone in his body. There had to have been a moment when he wasn't watching those canteens. Even if he denies it, it had to be someone in the club. I mean, he did come get her.
Oh, yeah.
She watched as he replaced the fuel tank cap and walked back toward her, wiping his hands on a rag. Then, whistling, he opened his kit bag and produced aish, stuffed with meat and olives. Manna in the desert, he stated with a grin and sniffed it. As long as it hasn't spoiled. Here, have some. No poison. Where in the world did you get these? Asked Allison with a brief smile. The kitchen, at the dining room. I bribed the Turkish guard. You bribed a guard, she repeated, surprised it was possible. How did you do that? They were all ordered to keep everyone under surveillance. Yes, so they were. Then he paused. So that was it. That's how it happened. He looked at her triumphantly. I left the canteens for a short time enough for someone to tamper with them. Allison felt a wave of relief as her eyes sought his, but the relief was short-lived. Even if it hadn't been David, someone else had anticipated their plans. Allison helped herself to one of the sandwiches while David tried his hand at climbing the tree to collect dates. He returned, boasting, if you marry me, you'll never be in want. He handed her a cluster. She smiled and bit into one. They were sweet and moist, some of the best she had ever tasted. Soon they were back in the motor car and on their way again. The afternoon shadows were lengthening as they bumped along the narrow road, collecting heat and dust. Allison, tense with uncertainty as she thought of Durabolis and what might wait there, shielded her eyes against the white-hot glare. She scanned the endless stretch of burning desert that filled the world as far as she could see. Having lived for 10 years in Cairo and before that India, she was well aware of the deadly toll of the heat. The starkness of the desert smothered her from all sides. She scooped the canteen from the seat beside her and swallowed a trickle of the well water. It eased her dry throat. Holding her sun hat in place with one hand, she turned her head to glance toward the camel-like hills. Allison's worst fear, like a mirage in the rippling heat waves. Allison's.
They'd have to rinse them pretty good.
Yeah, they probably had to rinse them pretty good before they filled them with the well water from the oasis. Allison's worst fears, like a mirage in the rippling heat waves of the desert, sprang up when David threw on the brakes and brought the motor car to a halt. The blazing sun relentlessly beat down on them. Flies emerged from nowhere and hummed like the sixth plague of Egypt. What is it? She breathed tensely. One look at his expression alerted her. He gestured in the direction of some sand dunes, shifting in the wind like slithering reptiles. We have company. Allison squinted against the glare, her heart coming to her throat. A patrol of Turkish cavalrymen, said David. Just our luck. They've spotted us, whispered Allison. Shall we try to outrun them on this road? They're riding Arabians. They would overtake us. It's too late. Here they come. Allison opened her handbag and pulled out Leia's papers. We have papers granting entry to Durabolis. They shouldn't bother us, unless they know about what happened back at the club. Allison remembered something that the Baroness had said the day after they had found Major Reuter dead. Colonel Holman had ridden to the German headquarters near Baghdad. Had he alerted them to be on the lookout? England and the Ottoman Empire, with its throne of power centered in Constantinople, were on friendly terms, she reminded herself, and England was making overtures to strengthen the friendship with the ruling Turks. They appeared to accept the olive branch with confidence. The Arab tribes in Arabia and Hejaz were another matter. The English traveled unmolested throughout Arabia, ignored by the tribal chieftains, except, as Allison knew, for some of the wilder Bedouin tribes who now and then attacked from the desert like ghostly phantoms. But for the most part, the Arabs disliked the Turks even more than they did the British, although they were bound together by the Muslim religion. Egypt, on the other hand, looked on the British in Cairo as an occupying force. England, in the face of war, worried about internal rioting, spying for the enemy, and an outright revolt. If the Egypt government in Constantinople sided with Germany and called on the Arabs and Egypt to revolt. Ajahad was always feared by the British. Friendship with Turkey was critical. No one in Arabia expected to be shot at by the Turkish cavalry on patrol, but few English, including Allison, underestimated the far-reaching effects of the winds of war blowing across the troubled face of Europe. Now that there was talk of Germany invading Belgium, it was nearly inevitable that tensions should also heat to a boiling point in Arabia, where Berlin was building the great railway into Baghdad and down south across the desert. Allison watched the cavalrymen riding across the blowing white dunes and nearing the parked motor car. As they approached, their formidable figures in the dark brown military uniforms with cone-shaped cloth hats almost seemed like a mirage because of the rising ripple of heat waves. The sunlight reflecting on their weapons soon dispelled that vain hope. They carried not only German carbines, but the traditional curved blade of the Turks called a scimitar. The Turkish captain, hard-faced, browned deeply by the sun, and wearing a short Muslim beard and Turkish mustache, lifted an abrupt hand to halt his half-dozen soldiers behind him. His sharp black eyes, like glowing pieces of coal, searched relentlessly as they fixed first on David, then swerved to scrutinize Allison, whose hair had loosened from the chignon.
Yeah.
I don't know how to say it. It's a weird word. She had put it into several hours ago. She felt a shiver run along her arms despite the boiling heat and the sweat that ran down her ribcage. Her worst anxiety had not imagined the flash of open dislike she saw when he noticed the red emblem on her nurse's uniform. The medical cross sewn on the front of her now soiled dress also spoke of her dedication to a faith considered a tenet of the enemy since before the time of the Crusades. It had been a mistake to wear her nurse's uniform, she now realized. She had thought it would grant them more leeway should they be stopped for questioning. She had been wrong. "Your nationality," he barked at Allison. "British, sir. We're with the Cairo Archaeological Club on our way to visit the home of my cousins at Jarablus. You'll be acquainted with their expedition house. Here, these papers will explain everything." A soldier took them from Allison and handed them to the captain. He read them carefully. "Yes, we're acquainted with the people from the British Museum of Carchemish. What are you doing here? Are you an archaeologist?" "We're staying near Aleppo with the club. While we're on holiday." He handed the papers back and turned to David. "Your papers." David reached a tanned hand under his tunic. "Slowly," warned the captain. "Why would a doctor who works to save lives shoot the Sultan's trooper?" With a bored smile, David handed him a folder. "You'll find it all in order, Captain." "Doctor?" Allison wondered where David had managed to get such papers, but didn't dare show her relief. The captain carefully studied the contents. "You're aware, Dr. McGregor, of a German officer's death back at the huts." Allison didn't move. She could feel the sweat stand out on her forehead. Then Colonel Holman had alerted the officials. "My orders are to detain anyone of suspicious nature," said the Turkish captain. "You will return with me to Jarablus." "Now, wait a minute," began David. The Turk jerked a hand for silence and looked abruptly at Allison. "You are a nurse?" "Yes," she stated quietly. What hospital in Cairo? Not a hospital, a ship. Ship? The Mercy? We travel the Nile, attending to the Fahalan, she said of the Egyptian peasant farmers. The Mercy. It is privately owned. By whom? She hesitated. It belonged to the British Foreign Mission in London. A certain death knell to her acceptance by this Moslem Turk. My aunt is in charge, she said truthfully but cautiously. Nurse Lydia Westcott. I work as her assistant. She's helped the Egyptian people for 30 years. The captain shifted his weight, and the leather saddle creaked. The droning flies pestered horse and human without respect to either. The captain's leathery face, dotted with sweat, showed nothing, and Alice imagined herself shrinking beneath that withering stare. Clearly, he was not impressed with her credentials, another meddling Christian using medicine to proselytize. So his gaze told her. What are you doing here? He demanded again. I've already explained, Captain. You are from the Nile, from working with the Egyptian Fahalan. What are you doing here? Here was the Arabian desert, perhaps a river of sorts, but one of perpetual sand, and, as he said, far from the Nile. He spoke in a tone that attempted to let her know she was not wanted, errands of medical mercy or not. I'm on leave, she said. As I've already informed you, sir, I'm a member of the club near Aleppo that belongs to Baroness Helga Kruger and Professor Jamal Pasha. We've come to the Carchemish digs, to the private home of my cousin Neil Bristow. The digs, said Allison quietly but firmly, are under British jurisdiction. Reminding him that the Turks had no jurisdiction there did nothing to make him relent. The heat was nearly unbearable when they were denied the wind of driving. She brushed away the horde of flies. Her cotton dress stuck to her. And there are other members of the club. Where are they? Came his deliberately accusing voice. A few kilometers from Aleppo, interjected David, apparently growing irritated with his badgering. What is this, Captain? Harassment? As Miss Westcott told you, we're a party of private citizens out for a week of holiday, enjoying our interest in archaeology. Captain, said Allison calmly, I see no reason for you to detain us. The papers representing the museum are all in order. The British consul has arranged with local governmental authorities at Baghdad to allow hospitality to the club from Cairo. One of your own, Baroness Kruger, has arranged these matters beforehand. You are right, Nurse Westcott, but that was before Major Karl Reuter was murdered. Murdered? Scoffed David. Your own Turkish doctor declared it an accident, and I totally agree. Are you not jumping to conclusions? After all, it was a German officer who got bitten by the cobra, not a soldier of the Ottoman Empire. England and Turkey's are allies, are we not? Allison held her breath, hoping David's word had won over the captain. Word from my superiors at Baghdad supersedes your personal wishes for holiday, he said bluntly. I am not to allow any strangers into Jarablus. I must detain you for farther questioning. Whatever for? Our papers are in order, said Allison. I have no question over your papers, he conceded. Then why are we being held? Demanded David. It's not our fault if some ruddy German officer gets himself bitten by a snake. You heard Miss Westcott. Your Sultan has granted permission to the British Museum to access the area around Carchemish. If we're not allowed into Jarablus, we can join T.E. Lawrence and Woolley at the site. The English missionary must turn back. Missionary, so that was how he wished to label her. It was a concern that at the best of times anti-Christian sentiment could lead to violence in the Muslim provinces. Brushing aside any further protest, he shouted orders to two of his Turkish soldiers, who dismounted and came to either side of the motor car, opening the doors. They gestured for David and Allison to get out. David was arguing, refusing to leave the motor car, as the captain ordered his soldiers to remove him from behind the wheel. What do you expect us to do, hitch a camel ride back to Aleppo? Snapped David. The captain shouted a curt order to the soldier, who swiftly raised the butt of his carbine and viciously struck the side of David's head, knocking him back against the seat. Allison gave a cry as the soldier grabbed David by the shirt front and removed him from behind the wheel. David, only half conscious, tried to reach for his revolver, but the soldier struck again and threw him into the hot sand. Then the soldier slid in behind the wheel. Another soldier latched hold of Allison, holding her to the seat. "Stay put. Orders." She looked frantically behind her and saw David stretched out unconscious on the blistering sand. "You can't leave him there," cried Allison. "He'll die from the heat. I'm a nurse. Please let me help." The soldier who gripped her arm suddenly called out his captain. "Up on the dunes, Bedouins. They are armed. A German soldier is with them." Allison looked across the sand to where a group of Arabian horsemen had appeared. She saw the German soldier shake hands with the five Bedouins, their robes blowing in the wind. Then he turned his horse to ride toward them. She swallowed, her throat dry, and flicked away the flies as the hot, dry wind whipped a strand of her hair across her eyes. The uniform with its iron cross was familiar. The German carried a revolver in a shoulder holster, a saber and a sheath, and a rifle. Allison cautiously took in the polished knee-length black boots, the cool and arrogant manner in which he sat erect on the blooded horse. There was no mistake. Colonel Holman. His blue-black eyes swept the scene and appeared to miss nothing, centering on David sprawled in the sand. Then he looked at Allison and held her gaze. She forced herself to look unresponsive, though her heart thudded. Was there any hope he was Brett Holden? She tore her eyes away from his gaze, doing her best to appear outwardly poised and unafraid. In reality, her knees trembled. The Turkish soldier continued to grip her arm so tightly she couldn't help but flinch. "Your manners, soldier. Are you afraid the lovely English spy will overwhelm you with brute strength and run away? Take your hand from her. I expect the soldiers of the Ottoman Empire to behave as gallantly as the valorous Germans," Colonel Holman stated flatly. The soldier drew a few steps back from the car door and stood rigid, glancing at his captain. With relief, Allison looked at the colonel, but he had turned in the saddle to face the Turkish captain. The captain looked furious over having his soldier openly rebuked by a foreign officer. Colonel Holman appeared utterly cool. "Trouble, Captain?" "Who asks?" came the too brief reply. Colonel Holman scanned him with a bored dismissal, reaching into his jacket and producing an identity card. He handed it to the captain abruptly, his impatience showing. "Colonel Holman from the German intelligence, Constantinople. I've arrived recently to command the Baghdad security police." The Turkish captain was suddenly uncomfortable and saluted, handing back the papers. "Yes, Colonel. We've received your orders to detain all strangers. I am Captain Mustafa from Beersheba, sent to Jarablus to deliver a letter to the commanding officer. I was on my way back to Beersheba when Major Reuter was killed. My new orders were to remain here on patrol duty." "I assume these are under questioning." "Yes, Colonel." "Good. Is all in order?" Captain Mustafa shifted nervously in the saddle. "Yes, Colonel. All in order." Allison's gaze crossed with Colonel Holman's. He was watching her. His eyes drifted to the red cross on her uniform. He took her in, expressionless. Allison again turned away her head, and in calm dignity, or so she hoped, fanned herself. "I am here to meet your commanding officer in Jarablus," said Colonel Holman. Captain Mustafa gave him a sharp, startled look. "Jarablus? You will meet Major Camille in Baghdad." "I have not come to meet your major. I do not have time to waste on meetings with low rank. The news I bring is for a private audience with your general." "The general, sir, is in Gaza. He will not arrive until next week." "Next week? Is that any way to treat the chief intelligence agent of General Krasvan Kressenstein? I have arrived from Constantinople with crucial information." "I am sorry, Colonel. I can do nothing until the general arrives next week." "Such ineptitude, Captain, is deemed unacceptable to the German military." The Turkish captain swallowed, but his black eyes were hard and bitter. "Yes, Colonel. Will you have us escort you into Aleppo?" "It is not necessary. I know this desert, Captain, as well as any Turk or Bedouin. I will not return to Aleppo tonight, but Jarablus. The food and wine are more to my liking." Yes, Colonel, he said through gritted teeth and saluted energetically. Colonel Holman half-heartedly returned the salute as though it were a waste, and then gestured with a smartly gloved hand toward Allison. She had been watching the display with cautious curiosity. He was full of conceit, or was it an act? She stiffened when she heard him say in a lower voice, "The English Fräulein. See, she is sent to my quarters at Durables tonight." Captain Mustafa's face flinched with disgust. "She is British, a missionary. She claims to come from Cairo." "Yes, I am aware," he said.
Demanding to put his quarters.
"Yeah, she'll figure it out." "What of him?" Mustafa gestured toward David. "Arrest him," said Colonel Holman. Arrest David? She couldn't allow them to take him away. In desperation, Allison opened the car door and stepped out, the sand burning beneath the soles of her shoes. The soldier guarding her glanced at her sharply, but made no move. "Please, Colonel Holman, can't you see he is hurt? Are you all beasts that allow him to lie there on the burning sand? What harm can he do you? You who have soldiers and weapons everywhere? Do you fear an unarmed, injured man?" "The woman is insolent," said Captain Mustafa. "You are quick to bestow your scales of mercy, Fräulein. It is perhaps your poor unarmed, injured Zionist is of special concern to you," Colonel Holman said derisively. Her eyes swerved to his dark gaze. Zionist, he knew, and it meant the end for David. At once she saw a glitter of hate spring into the Turk's eyes. "Zionist?" breathed Captain Mustafa. "He told me he was a Dr. McGregor is his name. I saw his papers." "His papers are forged," said Colonel Holman tonelessly. "You have much to learn from German intelligence, Captain." Allison's energy drained from her, leaving her fraught with disappointment. If he would alert the Turkish officer that David was Jewish betraying him, then he was not Brett Holden. Her gaze turned icy as she looked at him. "It is my medical duty to help him, Colonel Holman. I am sure you know little of mercy in your perfunctory duties." Risking herself, she gathered up a canteen and turned to walk to David. Her back was rigid with the anticipation of hearing his curt order to stop, but it didn't come, nor did the soldier stop her. She stooped, gathered David's bloodied head onto her lap, swishing away the biting insects that had already located the open wound. Then she heard Captain Mustafa say to the colonel, "I must bring the Zionist to headquarters in Aleppo for questioning. Colonel, I am under orders from my commander to detain and question all political troublemakers." "I suggest, Captain, you pay more attention to scouting and leaving intelligence gathering and questioning to the Germans. It so happens this man is a spy from Jerusalem, and I am under orders to bring him to Constantinople." Allison stared down at David with dismay. A spy for England. And she and Leia had doubted him. If only they had confided in him back at the huts, they might have escaped. She held him gently now, touching the bloodied side of his head. "David, David," her heart wrenched. "The Germans would kill you, or the Turks would. Any farther move on your part to thwart my orders will be dealt with by your own General Kismet Bey," said... Oh, that's wrong voice. Anyway. "Any further movement on your part to thwart my orders will be dealt with by your own General Kismet Bey," said Colonel Holman. The captain looked uncertain. The German continued his rebuke with provocative disdain. "The British and their Zionist friends are nosing about like fleas. Any stupid action will only cause more suspicion on the German presence in Aleppo. This man was to be arrested quietly. General Krauss von Krestenstein will not look lightly on this blunder. Now I must deal with the Fräulein to keep her silent. She is the daughter of Governor-General of Egypt." "Deal with her." As Allison knelt beside David, the insects droned noisily, or was it an insect? Allison raised her eyes to the cluster of small rocks and glittering sand beside the road. She froze. The noisy insect she had heard was a swarming coming from a reddish-gray viper with an X on its head. Evidently, its resting place away from the daytime heat had been disturbed by the movement of horses and soldiers. Nocturnal in habit, this one sat coiled, sending off its warning by rubbing its scales together. Its aggression and highly toxic venom made it one of the more dangerous reptiles in the area. It attacked indiscriminately, often leaping several feet from its coil. Allison's heart beat in her throat, and a prayer was on her lips as David took the moment to begin to stir from the whack on his head. She stared, transfixed, waiting. A bullet smashed into the viper's head, spattering bits and pieces across the sand and wetting her hand. She gave a sob of revulsion and pulled back, staring at the dead viper. She turned her head toward the soldier to see who had come to her aid. Startled, she saw it was Colonel Holman. He spoke to the Turkish commander. He will prove useful for information. Put him in the motor car. David would prove useful alive, but what of her? Had he not implied he must deal with her? To keep her silent over the incident. Then why hadn't he allowed the viper to silence her once and for all? How easy it would have been. She was careful not to look his way for fear the renewed hope she felt might betray her. Captain Mustafa apparently did not see the contradictory message in the colonel's action. He gave a brief, curt command to one of the soldiers to bring David. As for you, Captain Mustafa, see the Zionist and British nurse to Jarablus and bring them to my quarters. I want you there when we make the Zionist talk, or are you more squeamish than you boast? A satisfied gleam warmed the captain's eyes. His smile turned friendly as he understood the meaning behind the colonel's orders. He would get the pleasure of interrogating the Zionist. No, Colonel, no objection. Good. The colonel pulled down his hat. See, there are no further delays. He saluted. The Turk returned the salute and looked with diabolical pleasure at David Goldstein. Allison, confused, angry, and frightened, struggled to her feet and looked up at Colonel Holman. He met her gaze evenly, and she knew he must read her disgust, her revulsion. His jaw set. He scanned her, whipped his horse about, and rode ahead. Captain Mustafa dismounted and came to take the wheel of the motor car. A soldier led her to the front seat and ushered her inside. She slid in reluctantly and watched as David was hauled to stand on his feet and then shoved toward the back seat, where the soldier got in with him. This is what Colonel Holman wanted, she thought bitterly. Without another word, he had ridden ahead in the direction of Jarablus. At that moment, she loathed him and everything he stood for. He was turning David over to the commander, who obviously hated Jews. He had openly invited the captain's brutality. If she had mistaken the colonel's killing the viper for a moment of unguarded valor, she had been wrong. Her emotions numb, she sat there with Captain Mustafa, while Captain Mustafa turned the key in the ignition and pressed the starter button. The motor car stirred up dust and sand as he drove forward. Allison felt herself give way to her despair. Oh God, she prayed, what hope. Chapter 9. On a desolate stretch of wilderness road near the small village of Jarablus, a band of Kurds in turbans was waiting in the road on camels. They numbered more than a dozen, each one carrying a rifle, and Captain Mustafa was forced to stop. He shouted an order to his small troop to prepare to shoot, but one of the Kurds waved a white flat rag on a pole above his camel's head. Ride to meet him, commanded Mustafa. Allison watched nervously a rivalry between the Kurdish, Arab, and Armenian peoples existed against the ruling nation oppressor Turkey. Since the Seljuk Turks had conquered the territory before the Crusades, the Muslim Turks had eventually invaded Christian Constantinople and sections of Greece, ruthlessly persecuting both Greeks and Armenians. And they had little use for the Kurds, whom they had driven into the isolated mountains to live in poverty. The armed Kurds on the road outnumbered Captain Mustafa, and Allison wondered if she were to become trapped in exchange of bullets. Several minutes later, the Turkish soldier rode back to the motor car and handed Mustafa a sheet of paper. Orders have been changed, Captain. The British nurse is to be handed over to the Kurds. They are friendly and serve the German headquarters at the railway north of here. Colonel Holman says to bring the Zionist spy to his headquarters on the Euphrates. Allison tensed, and David, who was conscious and in pain, scowled murderously. You're insane if you think I'll let you turn Allison over to this band of renegades, he told Mustafa. Where she goes, I go. You have nothing to say on the matter, shouted Captain Mustafa over his shoulder, the official message in hand. I have my orders from the colonel, and they will be carried out. Duty before decency, is that it? David demanded. You are all the same. Silence, I honest. Your hour to talk will come. My hour will come, all right. The hour I see your ruddy Turks kicked out of Palestine. The captain turned with a rage, gripping his revolver as though he would enjoy using it on David, but Allison cried, Please, I'll go as ordered. David, just do as they say. We're both innocent, and they have to release us eventually. You're dreaming, scoffed David bitterly. You're measuring the Turks by British standards. Mustafa leaned over and threw open the door. His black eyes were cold as he looked from David to Allison. Good day, or Nurse Westcott. Her eyes pleaded with his. My friend is innocent. You'll give him his opportunity to explain, won't you? A smile showed beneath his square mustache. We will give him much opportunity. He waved the paper containing his new orders. You are to be brought to the British Expedition House at Durables. Colonel Homan will be in touch with you as soon as he has finished with Dr. McGregor. Expedition House? Neil and Leia's home? Allison got out of the car, her eyes anxiously meeting David's. He offered a half smile. Don't worry, he seemed to say. They won't get a word out of me. You can count on it. She did believe in him, and her heart wrung with anguish as the car drove away, leaving a trail of dust. David would have faced torture and death before he ever betrayed the Jewish cause or told them anything about Leia and Neil. Allison stood there alone, watching the dusty motor car disappear down the road. Her uneasy gaze turned toward the Kurdish rifleman. One of them rode toward her, a friendly smile on his face, and nodded his head in deference. Do not be afraid. We mean you no harm. Allison soon found herself seated on the camel and swaying in motion as they rode across the barren terrain in the direction of Durables. How could this be happening, she wondered, except for David, who would undergo interrogation by Mustafa. She couldn't have asked for a better alternative of plans. While she waited for the dreaded arrival of Colonel Holman, she could search the house. She doubted she would find anything important, but the search needed to be done anyway. Maybe Neil, like Major Reuter, had left some sort of coded message, though she had no idea how to recognize it even if she found one. The village life at Durables was grim. Glancing about as she rode on the camel behind the friendly Kurds, she could see little in the way of shops, not even a bazaar, where shopkeepers could barter bread and fruit. The people were downtrodden and poor despite her own problems. Allison's compassion soared at the sight. She imagined herself one of the women, downcast, clothed in Muslim black, with no opportunity to better her life on earth or in heaven. Words from various parts of Apostle Paul's letter to the church at Ephesus came to mind. Separate from Christ, alienated, strangers from the promise, having no hope and without God in the world. I wish I could give them a Bible in their own language, she thought. Without his love and comfort, they were orphans alone. Without his words, they and their children were prisoners of darkness, blind to the gifts offered them freely by God through the Lord Jesus. Unless the light and truth of his word reaches them, thought Allison, the darkness will multiply with the succeeding generations. Neil and Leia's stone expedition hut had several rooms. Spreading tree branches formed a roof over the front courtyard and showered the stones with mottled shade. The green branches were noisy with birds that fed on the black olives. The olives, in turn, dropped to the ground, staining the area with oil and drawing ants. Neil, of course, was not there, and the house greeted her with ominous silence. Allison had been informed by the Kurd that he would remain on guard in the courtyard, that she was to stay here until notified, and that she may yet be called to the German headquarters farther north toward Baghdad. Food was in the cook room, he told her, along with a small container of dried tea leaves. He then left, and Allison stood by the window musing over her circumstances and watching the Kurd water his camel and unload his bundle. Why would she be brought here? Surely the German colonel knew that she would not sit idle, waiting for his next move. She would search Neil's workroom to find any bit of information that might prove useful. And if she found a way to escape, she would, though the possibility was a slim one. Even if she could slip out of the house without transportation, she would never be able to cover the 90 miles to Aleppo. Wearily, she turned away from the window and stood gazing about the unfamiliar room with its frazzled pieces of furniture. Several simple wooden chairs with bright orange cushions, probably Leia's work as a seamstress, a black upholstered divan that had seen better days, a rough wood table, and one extraordinarily looking lamp. The base seemed to be blue marble and was magnificently carved into the shape of a robed woman with a basket on her head, apparently carrying bread. The lamp appeared to Allison to be worth a good deal of money. She was rather surprised that it was still here, unmolested by thieves eager to sell to dealers. The area was known by the British Museum to be rich in Hittite seal stones and all kinds of ancient objects that had been brought readily from villagers who supplemented their meager incomes by robbing graves and selling their finds to the Attica dealers based in Aleppo. Many such poor villages were located near the Euphrates, and private dealers toured them in search of Hittite seals to sell to the museums. As she stood there, she was struck by a knowing sentence that she was not alone in the house, and that she was being watched. A cautious survey of the other rooms, however, disclosed little more than her frayed nerves. I must stop imagining evils at every sound, she rebuked herself. The Kurdish guard had brought her bags into Leia's small room, and after tossing aside her hat and kit bag, Allison went to work, dedicating herself to a thorough search. With the lamps lit, the curtains closed, and every window and door bolted from the inside, she began by looking in the obvious places. As nightfall settled in, she had found nothing except some old letters from the archaeology school in Cairo. She was about to replace them in the little olive wood box when she saw the one of the envelopes postmarked from Cairo had come from Jamal Pasha. Now, what would the gaunt-faced Jamal have written Leia about? Archaeology, of course, except he had never mentioned knowing Leia. Were they business acquaintances, friends? Yet, when the discussion in the archaeology club's dining room had turned to Leia and Neil, Jamal had made no mention of knowing them. Had he preferred to keep it quiet? If he did, the obvious question was why? What did he have to hide? Now that Leia was beyond caring about protecting her privacy, Allison kept the letter. There might be something worth noting in the words. She slipped it inside her dress pocket and went on searching, but the task proved far more easy since the Kurd on guard was apt to check on her at any time. Proved far from easy. Tomorrow, the colonel might arrive and end any possibility of further searching, so even though she found it wearisome and disheartening work, she continued on doggedly. It was well after 9 that night when she came to the room that had belonged to Neil, and lighting the lamp, she began to rummage his desk and drawers. The room was also his office, and contained samples of pottery, books galore stacked here and there on the floor, and mounds of paperwork written in pencil. After a long and tedious search, she produced nothing of considered value. Then again, how would she know? What was she even looking for? The name of Carl Reuter? A message from Neil or Leia? It was frustrating. She had little to go on. Only the bits and pieces Leia had given her. When everything else had been searched, Allison turned with resignation to the stack of books on the floor beside Neil's worn chair. It was late, probably some time after midnight. She had no way of knowing the exact time since the clock on the wall on the table beside the bed had stopped, perhaps days ago. Tired and hungry, she decided to take a break from the thankless task and sample the fruit and tea the Kurd had left. She lit the oil lantern that waited on a table beside the cook-room door and entered the stone room cautiously. In the dimness, she saw the small stove and imagined the luxury item had been Leia's pride and joy. It probably had been brought up with pieces of furniture from Cairo or Aleppo. She struck the match and filled the kettle with water to boil for tea. While it simmered, she gathered the fruit she preferred from the wooden bowl: lush purple grapes and several figs, and cut a chunk of bread. She would take these with the tea to Neil's room and spend the late night hours searching his books. Some 20 minutes later, she was seated in Neil's big chair beside the lamp, a table drawn up in front of her and the stack of books at her feet. After munching grapes and sipping good British tea, she continued her search. It proved to be a disappointing endeavor, though occasionally she did come across a book that dealt primarily with the Hittites.
What did they do with David?
It proved to be a disappointing endeavor, though occasionally she did come across a book that dealt primarily with the Hittites. These she examined methodically for anything curious, underlined words or Leia Neil's handwriting, which she knew well enough to recognize. She examined them page by page, and when she found a half-sheet of scribbled notes by Neil, but his remarks proved to be merely professional calculations and deductions that had nothing at all to do with German espionage. Exhausted and unsuccessful, yet too tense to sleep, she leaned her head back in the chair and stared across the small room at the Hittite sculptures and inscriptions on the small library shelf. She must finish searching the remainder of the books before dawn in case her time here was cut short. For the moment, she lounged in the chair, listening to every creak and gust of wind about the house. She committed herself, Neil and David, to the faithful God she knew was always there. Yet life was full of tragedy, she reminded herself. She must not ever think that the proof of God's presence and blessing meant that circumstances would end well. The winds of tragedy and the floods of unexpected and unexplained hardship, ending in earthly disappointment, swept through the lives of even the most trusting of his saints. What if all this espionage turned tragic in the end? Leah had not been a Christian, and the unthinkable had happened. Somehow Allison had lulled herself into thinking that eventually Leah would turn to the Lord, and that God would allow her to live until the day. Instead, her life had come to a brutal end. Opportunities were like moving shadows, Allison decided. They ended just as surely as the sun ran its circuit through the heavens and then sat. Night always came, no matter how bright the noon. Time ran out. Her gaze moved to the clock on Neil's desk, the silent clock. Outside, the black night was full of noises, the murmur and mutter of the wind-driven leaves and branches on the trees in the courtyard, and the creaks that sounded on the roof as though a cat puttered across. The curtains on Neil's windows fluttered faintly from the draft sneaking in through the tiny cracks in the stone walls. Could anyone peer in as she sat beside the lamp searching the books? Again, the unsteadying sensation that someone watched her tickled the back of her neck. She kept her eyes on the book in her lap, afraid to look up, afraid she would see a face. The Kurdish guard, perhaps. He had not appeared evil, but rather a disciplined warrior type with comfortable gray in his mustache. Somehow, when looking into his eyes, she had thought she'd seen kindness, even sympathy. Consoling herself with this conclusion, she stood and with determination decided to get several hours' sleep in Leah's room. She picked up the clock, wound it, and set it to her approximation of the time. Then, leaving the lamp in Neil's room burning, she passed through the watchful house and Leah's bedroom. She still had the gun and placed it beneath the pillow. Lying down on Leah's bed, she remained fully dressed except for her shoes. She awoke some time later, sitting up with a start, every sense tense and alert. What had awakened her? The wind was blowing in savage gusts, and in the brief lull between them, Allison could hear a rapping sound. It was several minutes later before it was silent again. She carefully moved from the bed and went to the window, drawing aside the curtains. There was no moon, and the surroundings were black. Several minutes passed before she realized the light in Neil's room was out. She reached for the lamp and found the switch, but the light did not come on. The storm, she thought. A draft of wind rattled the window in Neil's room. Apparently the flimsy hook and eyelatch had come undone. She wasn't about to venture into the room to close it. She felt under her pillow for her revolver and stood beside the bed listening. After several tense moments, she heard nothing but the shutter moving to and fro in the wind. And being too suspicious, she thought, after all, the guard is on duty right outside in the courtyard. If someone were trying to get inside, he would need to pass through the court to get to Neil's window unless he came around the back wall. No one is there. It's just my nerves. I'll shut the window, and the room will be full of sand in the morning. She moved across Leah's room into the doorway of the sitting room and passed into it. No gleam of light penetrated through the curtained windows, but to her left in Neil's room she felt the wind coming through. She listened, but the roaring wind was too noisy, smothering any other sound in the lulls. The warped shutter creaked. Enough of this. She walked toward the room, and in the doorway could make out the moving shutter, but little else except the dark outline of the furniture. Allison stiffened, not daring to move. Her alarm turned to stark fear when she sensed movement behind the desk. She turned, unable to silence the catch of her breath. She opened her mouth to scream for the guard, but froze. What if it were he? Her hand tightened on the gun. Oh God, what am I going to do? She prayed. Whomever it was must have heard her. A hard breath drew in. Allison. Who's there? She gasped shakily. A friend. Brett Holden. A hand torch flashed on, scanning her face, and she turned her head away from the painful light. He set it on the desk, and a match flared up and steadied into a flame. He lit the oil lamp, and Allison, pale and frightened, stared at Colonel Holman. He was altogether familiar, yet a total stranger. You, came her dazed, dry whisper. I'll explain eventually, came his smooth voice, void of the curtness she'd come to expect. In place of the German uniform, he wore a cool white cotton shirt like the locals wore. A leather shoulder holster with a revolver was secured in place. The dark blue eyes were softer, less ruthless, yet they retained a distant callousness that suggested familiarity with a danger. His good looks were even more apparent now that he had removed the Iron Cross and everything hinting at Kaiser Wilhelm. Allison felt her face flush for no reason except that she feared he could read her thoughts. His brow shot up. Put away the revolver, will you? He quietly suggested. You'll end up shooting your transportation home to Cairo. Her spiraling fears came crashing down with such relief that her strength poured from her like water escaping the bottom of a rusty bucket. She felt her knees wouldn't hold her up. Down she went to the floor in a heap. The next thing she knew, his arms were around her gathering her up. I'm sorry, Allison. Brett sounded genuinely apologetic. I rapped on the door, and you didn't answer. The guard was dead. I didn't think you were here. I came in through the window.
The guard was dead?
Yeah. I didn't think you were here. I came in through the window. It was half pried open. It's all right now. He soothed her, his voice strong and resonant. I'll get you safely back to Egypt. Already partly pried open, she shivered. The terrors, confusions, and doubts that had haunted her since the night she followed Leia into Major Reuter's hut were over. The arms holding her close did not belong to a ruthless member of the German secret police, but to Brett Holden, a British professor, and she found them far too comforting. Her eyes rushed to his, and she noted again that while his appearance was the same bounty of good looks, the cold blue eyes were no longer ruthless or mocking, but warm, sympathetic, and much too captivating. She pulled away from his embrace, her lashes lowering. You won't need that now. He reached for her limp hand, taking the revolver and shoving it in his belt. Here, better sit down. He drew her away from the doorway to the small divan facing the desk. Are you all right? She nodded and said in a shaky whisper, The Kurdish guard you left is dead? He gave her a level look, revealing none of the painful emotion he must have felt. Yes, at first I thought I misjudged you, until I saw that window. Someone tried to break in here after eliminating the guard. She froze. You thought I did? He frowned. But I see you're as innocent and trapped in this event as I first suspected. He's dead, she gasped, whispering. Then someone did come here. I thought I heard something earlier. Was that you rapping a while ago? Yes. When you didn't answer, I became worried. Then I went around to the back and saw the window. It may have frightened off the intruder. The Kurd hasn't been dead long. Then if you hadn't come, someone else would have come through the window, she reasoned and tensed to keep from shaking as she sat on the divan watching him. You thought I killed the guard. Her strength returned with a flash, and she sat up straight, looking at him accusingly. Yes, he admitted frankly, and his mouth twitched with restrained amusement. And I wondered if I'd been a fool to give you that gun. For some reason, she felt indignant, as though he should have known she was the kind of a woman who didn't go about shooting people. Then she realized it was unfair of her on her part to think this of him. He knew as little about her as she did about him. She watched him, musing. Do you really think I could do it? That I'm working as a spy for I don't even know which side? Brett tapped his chin. No, he said with calm consideration. I don't. Not now, but it was possible. A demure face, among other noticeable charms, always makes a potent nemesis. And I might add, the qualities of a brave and noble nurse out to conquer the dragons of evil add to your dangerous mystique, especially one hardly out of her teens. How did you get mixed up in this? I'm far from a babe in the woods, if you mean to imply as such. I graduated nursing school in London all of 2 years ago. A very long time, I gather. A smile formed on his lips, which were a trifle more vulnerable than she had remembered. Of course, I was cautious of you. Even if Neil and Leia are your cousins, you were snooping about Carl's hut that night, and Leia would have been desperate enough to need a confidant. He gave her a level look. How much do you know? More than I know about this alias, Colonel Holman. Why should I trust you? I'm afraid you've little choice in the matter. Without me, you won't get a foot out of Durablus. And sporting that red cross on your uniform is the way you did when you came riding boldly into Turkish territory was naive and reckless. Now that you've made your opinion of me clear, said Allison breathlessly, would you mind, if it's not too much to ask, telling me what you're doing here? He smiled. I arrested you, remember? Looking for you, I did, and David too. It took a great deal of wit to save you both from Captain Mustafa. You mean, she began, confused, you did it purposefully? About unmasking David, I mean. It was the only way to deceive the Turk. Don't worry about David, he's a good friend of mine. Turning him over to the Turk was a necessity. If I hadn't lured Mustafa away with the diabolical prospect of taking out his venom on a Zionist, he would have beaten a path back to his headquarters and blown the whole thing wide open. I couldn't let anyone know I wasn't Colonel Holman until I had completed what I had come here for. You mean David isn't on his way to Baghdad? He's on his way here. Relief eased some of the momentary concern as she smiled for the first time. Under his gaze, she quickly grew serious. How did you manage? About Captain Mustafa? Mustafa is cooling his heels under Kurdish guard until we're safely out of here. The Kurds are your friends, I gather. They hate the Turks. They want their freedom. Their own land again, as do the Arab factions and the Jews. But let's not get into that now. No, let's not. Professor Holden. He smiled. Major Holden. But Brett will do nicely. Is it for real?
I can't believe them. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you're fine. Is it for real? The Major Holden of your new role? Maybe you're not German or British, but American. Just who are you? Would you mind dreadfully telling me the truth? She said with a touch of impatience. He regarded her meditatively, appearing to turn over something in his mind. After a moment or two, he apparently came to some decision, for he moved away from the desk and went to the window to latch it. He turned and came back, sitting in the chair opposite her. All right, my rank is genuine. Genuine. I have indeed been demoted from colonel to major, but that's quite all right because I'm definitely British and suspicious of the German Empire. I also shed the uniform with relief, finding no pleasure in the role of a devotee to the Kaiser. I happen to work for the military, and soon will be assigned to Cairo intelligence. And your name? Is it really Brett Holden? It is. Satisfied? Not entirely. Well, this is a pleasant surprise, Major Holden. Brett. I apologize for my rather rude behavior. I hope I didn't intimidate you too much. She smiled ruefully. You make a convincing colonel in the secret police. You understand it was a necessity, I hope. Actually, you saved my life, she said too casually, and reminded him about the crack shot which eliminated the desert viper. I didn't think it was wise to thank you then. Quite understandable, he said gravely, but his eyes smiled. Please accept my gratitude now, for tonight as well. I'm sorry about the Kurd, your friend. She thought about Leia. He must know David...
When did he shoot him?
She thought of Leia. He must know David would have told him. Suddenly she realized the matter of Leia's death was a perfect test. If he was who he claimed, if David was safe and waiting, then this Major Holden would know about Leia's death. You've been in the Middle East for long. A few months, was all he said. And she gathered he didn't want to say much more about it. Where were you stationed before that? Constantinople. You came to Baghdad as Colonel Holman? Yes. You know Neil and Leia? Maybe, he said non-committally. Now it's my turn to ask questions. Not yet. I'm not satisfied you are who you say. And you think it's important I satisfy your curiosity? Personally, no. But if you wish to ask questions, you won't get the answers until I'm certain you're telling me all the truth. He smiled. All. You'll have me in trouble with my superior. And whose superior are you? For a naive rosebud, you speak boldly. Don't you know you're playing a very dangerous game? I may be naive, as you put it, but I know what I'm about, and I intend to see it through to the end, because, Allison checked herself suddenly. No, tell me first why you were masquerading as a German officer that night in Major Reuter's hut. Brett hesitated, then staring at her a moment, he said firmly, You won't be staying. I'm seeing you straight back to Cairo, to the watchful eye of your family. Maybe, she said. He laughed shortly. Not maybe. Yes, you're going back. She smiled wryly, scanning him. I think you are telling the truth, at least about being a British major. You know how to give orders, don't you? And you expect me to follow them. He smiled. For your safety, of course. Or for your own. I admit your presence does put a certain damper on my activities. Getting you back without being noticed by the Turks isn't going to be easy. I didn't mean that. What did you mean? I meant that you would naturally wish me back at Cairo, tucked away somewhere to safeguard your identity, if you really are Colonel Brett Holman. Maybe it's the British Brett Holden you're pretending to be. Now we're getting complicated. Maybe you killed him tonight, and his friendly Kurdish guard out in the courtyard, she shivered. Then you are in grave danger. We are alone. She drew back a little, but somehow she didn't really believe there was any threat. You're safe, he said. At least from my German ambitions to silence any spy carrying crucial information back to Cairo. He didn't say what she wasn't safe from, and she looked away when his gaze briefly scanned her face. How well do you know David? He asked. Didn't he tell you? No, we didn't have time to discuss cozy strolls in London Park. I assume you and he had several of those? No, more like discussions. Her eyes met his evenly. We discussed whether Jesus is the Jewish Messiah or not. A dark brow lifted. She added firmly, any cozy strolls throughout London Park were done with the man I'm going to marry, Wade Finley. His expression remained impassive. A fine gentleman, I'm sure. Nurse Westcott wouldn't look at him twice if he didn't meet all her Nurse Westcott wouldn't look at him twice if he didn't meet all her expectations. Very wise of you. She turned away. He's coming to Cairo as soon as he graduates from Oswald Chambers Bible's training school. I command him, and you. And now that you have warned me to stay away from you, shall we pursue the matters of life and death? She looked at him, his bluntness taking her by surprise. A faint glimmer of cynicism showed in his smile. He hadn't been far from the truth when he suggested she wished to keep him at an emotional distance. It was a warning to herself as well. Are you going to tell me what you are doing that night? Are you going to tell me what you were doing that night in the German major's hut? She asked. Does he know Karl Reuter was a British agent? He leaned back, his relaxed posture contradicting his earlier suggestion of a life and death discussion, and placed his arm across the back of the divan. I knew the man who was killed. He was a friend of mine. You knew him too, didn't you? You were there in his hut looking for something. How about it, nurse? Allison held back, her eyes meeting his level stare as the minutes ticked by. What were you looking for? He demanded, too quietly. The wind blew against the side of the house, and the light from the oil lamp flickered in the draught, throwing leaping shadows on the low ceiling. Allison spoke at last, uncertainly. I didn't go there to search for anything. I told you why I went there when you interrogated me. I saw someone enter the hut. I suspected a burglar. I didn't know the dead German officer. Brett stood and walked over to Neil's desk where the stack of books sat. He looked down at them thoughtfully, and then at Allison. She knew he suspected her of having gone through them. Find anything? He asked flatly. When she said nothing, he walked back and stood over her, frowning. You're involved in something much more dangerous. You're involved in something much more dangerous than you imagine. You're wrong. I do know. Major Reuter was murdered. So was your Kurdish friend tonight. And she stopped, her eyes searching his in the lamplight. They were penetrating beneath black lashes, almost moody, she decided. And so was Leah Bistro. He filled in for her quietly. Yes, I know, David told me. They came across her body out at the Roman Syrian digs. He also told me something else, something not even you knew. He understood. Her kit bag was empty, and her revolver was missing. Both were taken by the enemy. He looked at the stacks of books belonging to Neil. Do you think you would find what was taken? For a long moment she stared into his calm and wavering eyes and seemed to draw strength for them. You can trust me, he said. She saw no reason to keep something from him now, and she nodded, clutched the chair's arm. Allison believed him. Perhaps it was his gravity or the care in his quiet voice when he spoke of Leah's body, but whatever it was caused her to lower her head into her hands and blink hard to keep back the emotional release of tears. No, I don't think I'd find what they took here. She sat down beside her and said softly, I'm sorry, Allison. She told me that she received a message from Neil. She had been waiting to hear from him for 2 days since before the agent was murdered at the huts. Alert, he attended her every facial expression. Yes. Allison shivered suddenly, as though the air had become cold. After she left, I heard a noise at Major Reuter's hut, like a door moving on a hinge. I felt as though someone had been out there listening to us. I was afraid, but I couldn't turn to anyone. She made me promise to say nothing, no matter what might happen. The Turkish authorities must not be brought into this, she kept telling me. And if anything were to happen to her, I was to... Her voice faded, and she swallowed back the emotion that wanted to break out. His eyes flickered over her face. Yes? Carry on her work? She nodded. He was silent for a time. Then, you know who Carl Reuter was? She nodded. A British agent. He let out a breath, his displeasure growing. Leia needed my help, and she believed she could trust me, Allison whispered defensively. He didn't look pleased, but asked firmly, How much do you know? She lifted her face and looked at him now, this time with open curiosity. Enough to know we're all in danger. She had no choice. Without me, she wouldn't have made it as far as she did. I don't know how much she told you, he said, but I'm afraid she told you more than she should have. She may have needed your help, but by involving you, she's also placed you in the same dilemma she was in. Someone tried to break in through the window tonight. If I hadn't come when I did, well, you get the picture, I'm sure. She remained outwardly composed. I think you had better tell me the truth, Allison, all of it. Are you one of them, a British agent? You'll need to take my word for it. I don't go around carrying papers, and I'm obligating you to silence. Her relief provoked a half smile. Instead of papers saying Major Holden, you go around snapping orders in German. I shall miss being called Fräulein. Maybe I can do something about that in Cairo. A small flush warmed her face, and to conceal it, she said too firmly, I don't think so. Amusement flickered in his eyes. Wade Finley, yes. I quite get the message. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves, aren't we? Yes, quite ahead, she said quickly. If you are, as you say, on our side, what is this all about? First, how much does the noble Nurse Westcott know? Everything, please, from the beginning. Allison told him, starting with her arrival at the huts for her holiday. She spoke quietly, this time keeping her emotions under firm control, for something in his level gaze restrained her. She explained again how she had been awakened to hear someone entering the officer's hut, and her surprise at seeing it was her cousin Leia. She had followed her, only to have someone come up behind her, pushing the cold barrel of a gun against her neck. I didn't know who you were in the dark, apologized Brett. You might have been looking for information. I admit you gave me quite a shock when I came back and switched on the light. Once again, she could almost hear the stealthy footsteps of the third man after Brett had gone out the front door after Leia. Allison went on to explain how Leia had been waiting for her when she returned to her own cabin after his interrogation. How she had kept Leia hidden there for 2 days while they waited for Neil and avoided the ominous Colonel Holman. She admitted that Leia had found the coded word. You know about that? He scowled. She didn't explain what was in the information, only that it would hold an more important clue as to where to find it. I'm not even sure what it is that we're looking for. Not we. You're not going to get farther involved. No wonder I was foiled when I searched Carl's hut. They had already taken it. Only the code word. Say that again, he said sharply. Allison leaned toward him. We only guessed what the word meant after a day. It was Wooley's book, The Hittites. Major Reuter had left it on the table. Ruddy luck. I saw it when I searched. Ruddy luck. I saw it when I searched. I don't know. I can't think of an English accent right now. You didn't have the code word, so you wouldn't know. Thanks for making excuses for me, but I beg to disagree. I should have suspected. Anyway, go on. While I watched the club members in the dining room during lunch, Leia went back into the cabin and retrieved the book. He took a hold of her arm. Are you saying that you have it? No, Leia had it. She took it to Neil. He stood, pulling her to her feet, his eyes holding hers. That's impossible. Neil isn't anywhere around this part of Arabia. She told me she had received a message from Neil. She was to meet him. She believed it. As Allison talked, it was as though she was reliving the incident. She saw Leia's face again in the oncoming evening shadows, heard that stealthy sound on the back porch after Leia had left to meet Neil. Someone followed her. Once again she seemed to hear Leia's relieved voice, see the almost happy face, as if a heavy load had been lifted from her heart when she grew certain The message was from Neil and that their superior had arrived to take up the burden. Allison explained in a quiet voice about their disagreement, how she had believed something was odd about the message coming from Neil. We discussed the very thing that happened to her, but it was as if she wanted to believe it because she had grown hopeless, said Allison. I couldn't understand why, if the third man had been Neil, he hadn't been able to understand the coded word at once when he saw it the way Leia did. Allison saw Brett frown and understood he wasn't happy about her knowing so much. It was too late to worry about what he thought, she told herself. She did know whether it had been wise of Leia or not, and she went on with a determined voice, using more calmness now to try to convince Brett Holden that she was capable and trustworthy. She was the happiest I'd ever seen her since I arrived, her voice broke with a dry whisper. But I didn't want her to go. We debated the possibility of it being the murderer waiting for her instead of Neil, and I wanted to go with her, but she refused. She was right, said Brett. Allison couldn't resist. Yet, without my high being there with Leia, you wouldn't know about the supposed message from Neil, or where she went, or about a number of other important things I haven't been able to explain yet. But it may be too late, he said more to himself than to her. The book passed to the other side. They can load the Kathy information first. I've no notion where Carl stored it for safekeeping. She raised her head. Maybe they don't have it. There's more, Leia. There's more. Leia was careful. It was expected of her, she said. Even with Neil, she had orders to play it safe, so she took a sheaf of papers in her bag, as though it were the information. It was a red herring, she called it. Good. Smart woman. And my books, even my Bible, she took those as well for a diversion. Whoever killed her for the information has the wrong thing. Your books and Bible. And you let her, I suppose. What were you thinking of? She didn't understand her objective. She didn't understand his objective. Objection, sorry. She didn't understand his objection. Of course I let her. They made the perfect red herring. Exactly, and made you the new bait instead. She shuddered. What do you mean? Leia wouldn't have done it deliberately. It sounds as if she were desperate. But by taking your books and papers, she unwittingly convinced the other side you were involved. Don't you see? They'll think she may have told you the information. They may even think you have it. He looked toward the window thoughtfully. No wonder someone tried to break in here tonight. That's why the guard is dead. Allison shivered. I don't understand. It's simple. After Carl was eliminated, it left two people who knew about the book. Neil and Leia. Neil sent a mayday to me, but then you were his superior. Yes, but that's between you and me. Of course, she scanned him. But they know about you. So that makes 4 people who knew about the book. 3, he repeated. They don't know about me. The arrival of Colonel Holman took care of my identity. With Carl dead and Neil delayed, that left only Leia. We know what happened to Leia, he said gently. Because of the brilliant red herring, they now have someone else to worry about. Nurse Allison Westcott. They aren't certain how much you know, but they don't take chances. She shuddered. I hadn't thought of that. No, he agreed. I didn't think you had. Now, do you see why you're going straight back to Cairo? But I promised Leia. Whatever you promised Leia you can turn over to me, where it belongs. You're a nurse serving on a medical missions ship, if I recall. And that's where you belong. After I get you home, you're out of this. She lifted her head and her mouth set. You're so sure of that, Major Holden. Because I'm not, and you haven't explained yet what it's all about. Look, Allison, 3 people are dead. All friends of mine, all dedicated to a patriotic, noble cause. And if you don't mind my putting it that way, this is not your fight. I don't want to see you end up like Leia. She stood with dignity. You're wrong, Major. It is my fight. Patriotism is not enough. I owe England and the cause of freedom my full support, and I'll do what I can. What I must, to see whatever it was Leia died for come to a successful end. Yeah. He frowned. Yes, I'm afraid you mean that. All very noble and charming, but unwise. If you wish to live long on the good earth and see your grandchildren, afraid I mean it? You who risk your life every day to serve your country, you were disturbed that I feel patriotic, that I care. After finding Leia in the sand, what else could I feel? He watched her. You are too curious, too brave for your own good. Save your valor for the Mercy. Wasn't that the name of the ship? Then show your mercy on the Fahalan and await the arrival of your true love from Chambers Bible School. If you don't, well, you get the message, I hope. How like your type, Major, to send me to the stands while you risk your life every day among the lions. Well, I won't sit in the stands. If you won't let me help you, I'll do it alone, for Leia. He gave her a narrowed side glance. pardon me, but you'll do nothing of the sort. If I must resort to certain influence I can apply in Cairo, I'll do so to have you kept out of this. You forget who my father is, she said, with a victorious smile. He's quite patriotic, and would be proud to see me involved. He gave a short laugh. So you think. It may be that I know him better than you realize. By the way, what did you mean I'm behaving like my type? He inquired dryly. You have me all figured into a nice, neat little package, do you, Miss Westcott? And just how do you see my type? She walked away from him to the divan and sank into it. She wouldn't tell him what she thought of him, because it wasn't what he expected. She found him valiant and bold, and too memorable. She changed the subject back to Leia, and beginning to think that Leia might not have taken the book with her after all, but hid it before she went to meet Neil.
If I had to pick one, I think I'd fall over David.
A gold mine, if it were true, but it would leave the door wide open. It means I'm still in the fight. I think she didn't take it because my hut was searched, not before her death, but afterward, just before David and I left to come here. Then you see what I mean. Then you see what I mean? Of course. If they had what they wanted, they wouldn't still be looking. You're certain it wasn't the Turkish officials? David said they arrived to search all the huts. I thought so at first, but I'm not convinced now. They were late in arriving and only had been there a short time before David and I left. But my drawers were searched before that, yet I don't know how, because we were all out at the digs when Leia was found. It could have been someone who's not in the club, and we don't know when she was murdered. It could have been the night before, which gave the morning free to search before you went to the digs. I don't suppose you remember anyone missing from the dining room at breakfast. She looked guiltily. I overslept and missed it, so I wouldn't know, but obviously if I were still sleeping, no one could have gotten in. He smiled. And what did you do after breakfast? I attended a lecture. It could have happened then. You went out to the digs afterward? Yes, after lunch. But, Major, if Leia didn't take the book, where could she have hidden it? And wouldn't she have been careful enough to leave some sort of message in case it wasn't Neil after all? Yes, and I wish I knew. She told him of her own suspicions of Baroness Helga Kruger and of Professor Jamal Pasha. We've been watching Jamal for months. You have? And there's something else. Leia wasn't supposed to have gone to the abandoned digs to meet Neil. I know, because she told me about a hut halfway between here and the Carchemish digs. They sometimes stored pieces there. Neil was to have...
They stored pieces there.
Neil was to have a candle glowing in the window when she arrived, if all was safe for her to enter. If she got that far, I'm certain the candle would have been burning brightly, he said bitterly. She would have walked straight into a trap, but the trap was much closer at hand, only a mile or so from the huts. The motor car, for instance. You said she told you it was concealed at a half-mile away. She says that Neil put it there for a safeguard. Most likely, whoever it was knew about it and was waiting there. Disposing of her at the abandoned digs would have been easier than driving the 90 miles here to Jarablus, and much closer. If it were someone in the club or in Aleppo, I'm not ruling that out either. A German consul there works closely with the Turks. You mean the enemy may not be someone from the club after all? She felt relief. Nothing can be ruled out. I'll need to search the hut where Neil was said to be waiting for Leia. But she didn't go there. It was too far. I don't think she did, but I may find something else there. Anything. How well did you search your hut before you left with David? Meticulously. There was nothing. Certainly not something the size of a book. Nevertheless, I'll check it again myself, just to make sure. How can you? If you return, they'll know you're not Colonel Holman. My dear, I really am as open as I had to be when betraying Colonel Holman. I prefer to work in secret. I am a skilled but honorable burglar. What I need to do, I'll do without getting caught. If only Leia and I had known who you were, said Allison. Yes, we crossed purposes, didn't we? A rotten bit of luck. But you're still alive, and I intend to keep you that way. Believe me, I didn't come on holiday to run into espionage, but to learn more about archaeology. My interest was purely biblical. And I just sort of, bumped into this. Yes, he said smoothly. I recall the memorable moment in Major Reuter's hut when we did bump into each other. However, I'd give anything if it had been the third man instead of you. One thing is certain, it wasn't Neil. He stood. Whatever happens, we'll need to get out of here as soon as David arrives. He frowned. He's late. Anytime anyone is late, I have reason to worry. He walked over to the desk. The Turkish officials will soon know that Colonel Holman is due to arrive this afternoon from Baghdad. When they do, they'll be scouring all of Jarablus for his counterfeit. He looked at her. Have your things ready and packed, will you? They are. I never unpacked them. Will David come with a motor car? If he's successful. Otherwise, he'll use my horse. He'll need to make it on his own. I can't take chances of weight, not with you here. In the little silence that followed, the lantern flickered. He stood, looking down at the books, deep in thought. Allison walked up. Then no one else knows the information Major Reuter discovered, not even you. No, although, he stopped. Although what? She pressed. He looked at her, his blue eyes intense with musings all their own. I have an idea. I've seen and heard enough to understand what the Germans are planning. Even so, the documents our agent confiscated in Constantinople were crucial because they contain the official proof needed by the British government. Her excitement grew. Official proof of what? He didn't answer. And Alice said, with Reuter's death and now Leia's, what hope is there? How will we ever know the truth? You've no idea where he might have hidden the documents? No. The answer is likely to be found in the book. The wind whined along the side of the house, and once again, as earlier that night, Allison became aware of the sensation of being watched. Yes, the book, but where had Leia hidden it? In the lull of the wind and the silence following, footsteps sounded outside in the courtyard. That's the end of part 1. Chapter 10. Allison's eyes darted toward the window on which someone tapped. A startled gasp came to her lips as she took a step backward against the desk. Brett threw an arm around her shoulders, drawing her toward him, his face inscrutable as he held her to him. Don't be afraid, it's only David.
What is inscrutable?
Don't be afraid, it's only David. Allison managed to calm herself and nodded, unsure whether his presence made her feel more secure or not. The last few days of peril leading up to Leia's death and culminating tonight with Brett coming in through the window had left her jittery. Brett released her and she drew away, feeling somewhat foolish after insisting she was capable of carrying on Leia's work. To divert Brett's attention from her reaction, she asked, what happens now? First, let's hope he was able to obtain a vehicle. Brett walked to the window, giving an answering rap. Her eyes followed him across the room, noting his muscular build and how he looked every inch a well-trained soldier. Even in the white shirt and trousers, the floor vibrated beneath his calf-length military boots. She must not notice. She felt a sense of guilt when she remembered Wade Finley. Who, Finley? What happened to the Mercedes? She asked. His dark head turned, his level gaze non-committal, and his tone casual. Oh, the Kurds had a bit of trouble convincing Mustafa to release David to their care. It was damaged a little. She dared not contemplate what that meant. I see. Brett nodded toward the pistol on the desk. I'm going out to talk with David. We'll be gone a short time. If anyone you don't know comes in, use it. Her heart quivered. Where are you and David going? To look about, he stated evasively. Giving Allison no time to protest, he passed through the darkness of the sitting room. A moment later, she heard the front door close behind him and his footsteps scrunching on the scattered sand of the courtyard. Allison stood still, straining to catch every sound in the night, her heart thumping. She had the wild notion to run after him, but clamped a restraint on her emotions and moved over to the desk, where she reclaimed the gun he had first given her in Major Reuter's hut. Taking a moment to remember, it hardly seemed possible Major Brett Holden could be the same man who had so intimidated her with accusations on the night of the agent's death. Brett was now risking his securities to salvage her own. Had he wished to do so, he could have escaped alone with a far better chance to make it back to Cairo undetected by either Turkish or German authorities. She was aware that for the three of them to escape Jarablus and drive the 90 miles back to Aleppo would be harrowing indeed. As Brett had said earlier, the German headquarters near the railway would soon discover he had been an impostor of the real Colonel Holman. She wondered about Brett. He had purposely left much undisclosed for security reasons, and much he hadn't mentioned because of the brevity of time. If they returned safely to Cairo, she decided she would inquire about him from her father, Sir Marshal Westcott. As retiring consul general, he would have access to certain information about what was happening in Cairo intelligence department. Suddenly, she longed to see her father again. During the last several years, she had seen little of him. His work and dedication to King Edward had long been a source of friction between him and her mother. Her mother, Eleanor Bristow Westcott, believed Sir Westcott had for too long neglected his family and marriage for the good of the British Empire. Her father was soon to arrive home from India, where he had been for the last 3 months in meetings with the British Viceroy of India. Now Allison longed to be home too, and Port said, "Perhaps I'm not made for espionage after all," she thought. She was still thinking of all this when Brett returned alone some 20 minutes later. He stood in the doorway with the lamplight flickering against his silhouette. Without expression, he looked at her. When she walked up to him, however, she could see the deliberate restraint of an underlying concern in his narrowed gaze. While he may have been looking at her, his thoughts were elsewhere. She tried to match his calm. "Well, where is he?" "David?" "Yes, David. You said it was him. You mean it wasn't?" "No, it is Hammond. But David is on his way. We have a vehicle, and we'll need to leave in a hurry as soon as he arrives." "Who's Hammond?" "My assistant and a friend." He walked quickly to the stack of books Allison hadn't searched and grabbed his satchel from the floor beneath the desk. He tossed in the books along with the contents of the drawer as Allison walked up. Your insinuation that matters are under control is only meant to quiet me, isn't it? Something happened to David," she said. He looked at her, keeping that same impenetrable manner that unnerved her. No, he should make it. She struggled to emulate his unearthly calm. "Should? You mean he might not?" In this business, there's always that chance, but David is capable and steady. I noticed that about him in London. I'm counting on him. He looked at his watch. He has 10 minutes. She swallowed, brushing a curl back from her face. 10 minutes? What happens in 10 minutes? Why not 15? Why not 20? He threw open a drawer and took out several folders, stuffing them into the satchel. "In 10 minutes we leave, with or without him." She stared at him, unbelieving. "Leave without David?" "Yes, we've no choice in the matter." "I won't," she stated with incredulity. "He's a friend of mine. You said he was yours as well." "He is," he admitted briefly, ignoring her gaze. He was behaving badly, and she didn't understand it. Earlier, he seemed to go out of his way to try to shield her from her fears. "If the authorities catch him, they'll transport him to Baghdad," she warned. Knowing he already knew this, frustrated, she clipped. "A fine way to deal with your friend, Major Holden." He stopped and looked up from the drawer. "What do you prefer, Nurse Westcott? Your death, mine, Hammond's?" Her eyes questioned his as her hands turned cold with anxiety. "The Turkish officials know we're here. Is that it?" His eyes held hers evenly, glimmering with warning. "Germans," she swallowed. "They know who I am and who Hammond is," he said. "That much in itself wouldn't convince me to abandon a friend like David, but you're here. I don't doubt for a moment you would end up the victim of an accidental death reported to the Turkish officials, who would in turn notify the British consul in Aleppo, with apologies." She stepped back, wishing to let out a gasp of fear, but determined to show herself calm and courageous, she turned away, biting her lip. He firmly closed the desk drawer. "I'm sorry, Major. I shouldn't have intimated you were abandoning a friend." "Think nothing of it, Miss Westcott." She watched him. "I suspect you're quite valorous when it comes to friend and country." The shadow of a cynical smile showed as he briefly scanned her. "You may find that estimation also exaggerated. I'm neither coward nor hero, but caught up in something I can't turn loose of until I see it through to the end. I stumbled into it quite by accident. So you see, your English Bible student, what was his name? Wade Finley, is quite more the valorous gentleman." Allison flushed. She feared Brett saw through her avowed disinterest and had deliberately mentioned Wade to watch her response. "That isn't true of you either, is it?" He regarded her. "What isn't true?" You're stumbling quite by accident into this espionage situation, she stated. You're not caught up in something you don't care a rat about. You care about it deeply. It's written all over you. Caring strongly has something to do with my type again, I suppose. You'll need to explain it to me sometime when the Germans aren't breathing down my neck. As for my being transparent, I didn't think I was, he added with faint dismay. I hope not. She didn't find him transparent and suspected he knew she didn't. Except for a deliberate militaristic deportment, he was utterly unfamiliar. She could only make a guess at what he was actually like. That she was faintly curious brought as much concern to her as the idea of transparency apparently did to him. He buckled shut the satchel and turned toward the doorway into the sitting room as footsteps announced Hamid. Allison saw a Kurdish warrior, but he looked nothing like she expected except for a faded black scarf wound around his head. He was dressed much like Brett, in canvas tunic and trousers with heavy boots. He seemed to be in his 40s, well conditioned to the Arabian desert and apt to defeat any who dared to come at him. He had a collection of fierce-looking weapons, most of them Western in origin, and he looked as if he was well versed in their use. His walnut-colored face was rugged and quietly determined. He had thick, dark brows above eagle sharp, black eyes that were not so hard that they didn't pause to look kindly at Allison before addressing Brett. There is little time left, Major. If you delay longer, they'll be upon you. Go, take Miss Westcott with you. I will stay, and perhaps David and I will meet you at the oasis. The friendship and respect that passed between the two was not lost on Allison. Brett had been right. Hamid was his loyal assistant. If Brett was displeased over the risk this brought to his friends, he didn't show his emotions. Life and death already had been decided on between these two friends. She could tell by the cool, unemotional response displayed by both of them, but there was also no mistaking their bond. Brett handed the oil lamp to Allison to take with her into Leia's room. As she rushed for her bags, she overheard Brett ask Hamid in a low voice, "And he says us?" "Guns and ammunition in the back of the vehicle." "How many?" "Enough for him to take to the others." "Good work." "Spare patrol?" "Petrol?" "Not enough. They heard me." "Then we'll need to find it on the way. You know where to locate me. You know what to tell David." "I will tell him. Go, Major. We will make it." Surprising and wondering, Allison hesitated in the doorway where she could just make out their silhouettes. Guns? Ammunition? For what? Where had they gotten them, and why? Brett must have seen her standing there, for he said something indistinguishable to Hamid, then with less secrecy added, you don't become a martyr for your heroics. With your heroics, we'll need you for a more desperate time. Maybe it won't come. We have good plans, you and I." Allison came out dressed modestly in a plain high-necked and long-sleeved blue cotton frock that reached her ankles. Actually, it was an older uniform she had used during her nurse's training, but she had removed the cross from the bodice. She hadn't bothered to roll her hair into a chigon, but there was no time, but had tied it back with a ribbon and carried a canvas hat with a wide brim. With the rising of the sun, the day would be long and miserably hot. Her shoes were heeled leather boots, comfortable and practical for desert wear. She held her kit bag and looked at Brett, her eyes still pleading for David. Either he didn't notice or chose not to, for he retained an inscrutable expression. "Ready?" She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Hammond led the way, a hand resting on his rifle. Brett took hold of her arm and propelled her out the back door and swiftly crossed the back courtyard. The wind met them head-on, hot and dry, throwing sand at them and scattering brown, brittle leaves. "Where are we going?" she asked in a half-whisper. He gave a brief laugh. A car waited and Hammond ran to the passenger door while Brett went to the driver's side and threw it open. Allison scrambled in beside him, wondering what manner of vehicle it was. Hammond slammed the door as the engine raced to life. The vehicle braked out of the courtyard, the lights still out. Allison's heart was in her throat. Then she heard Hammond call, "He's coming." "David,"
cried Allison joyfully, looking over her shoulder. He's running. The vehicle swept back in a tight arch and paused. Brett reached back, flicked open the back door lock. David scrambled in, Hammond just behind him. Before Hammond shut the door, the vehicle swept around and was shooting for the narrow back exit. Brett flipped the headlights on for a moment, then off again, and Allison held her breath. The engine ran smoothly as the narrow road flew past, the headlights still out. "A ruddy mess," said David, his voice breathless from running. "They're not far behind." "How many?" asked Brett, stepping on the throttle. 5, 6, maybe 8. Sorry, I didn't mean to lead them to the rest of you." "We're glad you made it. You had me worried," said Brett. "I was wondering if you had what it takes." The goad was tinged with just a flicker of humor, and David mumbled.
David's there.
Yes, David's there.
Oh.
And David mumbled, looking behind his shoulder through the rear window. "I was beginning to wonder, too. I still am." Hammond gave a chuckle and hit him on the shoulder. "Is this the first time a Jew and a Kurd teamed up against one enemy?" "If it is, old man, it won't be the last," said David. "Where are they now?" Brett looked through the rearview mirror while adjusting it. I don't see them following," said Hammond. "Don't count on it," warned David. "I thought I was 5 minutes ahead, then from out of nowhere this ruddy German vehicle bore down on me and opened fire. They blew out the back tire, and I swerved off into some peasant's front yard, nearly killing them a chicken for supper. I was able to outrun the Germans on foot through a yard. Some grandma with a basket of eggs was yelling at me, shaking her fist." Hammond laughed. Brett smiled. "Lucky for you, she didn't have a basket of rocks instead. She would have landed you for the Germans." "I saw their car head toward the expedition hut, but now they're gone. But now they're there. By now they're there," warned David. Both he and Hammond looked through the rear window. "I don't see them," David said. "I don't suppose they're using lights either," Brett noted. His voice, Allison thought with chattering teeth, was as unexpected as though discussing was unexcited as though discoursing on the weather. "Keep watching," said Brett. "If they follow, we'll need to flash them on when. Damn it! If they follow, they'll need to flash them on when they near the back drive." Oh, they're lights. Allison, too, turned in her seat to stare out the small rear window. Brett swung the vehicle onto the main road, where they were soon speeding toward the desolate wilderness. Allison saw the brief flash and exclaimed, "They're coming. They're onto us." "They're onto us," said Hammond. Allison looked at Brett and saw him glance at the speedometer. "What are they driving, David?" She knew why he asked. They would need to run for it, and if the Germans had a faster vehicle, they were in trouble. "Looks like a Hun machine," said David. "Probably a Mercedes." She glanced at Brett, but either he was used to concealing his thoughts or he knew she watched him, for David might as well have suggested they themselves were on mules. "There is always hope," said Hammond pleasantly, and ambled off on a story about a lame-footed camel and a Turkish armored car. I suppose the camel prevailed in the end," said David. Hammond smiled. "Why not? The camel can go without water for a long distance, and the armored car needs petrol." "I don't see how that tale applies. We both have petrol, but they have the Mercedes," David observed. But the Mercedes depends on tires and a radiator." "So that's what Brett has in mind." Brett glanced over his shoulder at Hammond. The exchange must have told the Kurd something, for he reached to the floorboard. Allison heard him opening a case. Several seconds later, he lifted out 2 guns. Allison suspected they were German-made, but other than that, they were unfamiliar. Hammond also produced several carbines and a box of ammunition, leaving them within easy reach. She tensed, gripping the seat, and looked again at Brett. He swerved suddenly and drove the vehicle off the road and toward some dunes. For speed were no Mercedes, but were built for terrain. "Hold on." Allison clung to the seat as they slowed sharply to a bumping, swaying crawl down what looked to her to be a caravan road made for camels and horses. On either side of them were mounds of sand and rocks. Brett didn't wait long before he gestured to Hammond and David, who flung open their doors and clambered out, carrying the weapons. Allison reached for her door to do the same, but Brett's hand caught her wrist, and their eyes met in the moonlight reflecting off the white sand. Stay here. We'll be back when it's over. Understood? She tried to swallow the fear that came to her throat. She guessed they were going to ambush the German vehicle, and her heart was thudding so hard she was breathless. Don't worry, he whispered, adding casually. Hammond and I have done this before. I was hoping we could avoid it, but he opened the door and was out. Stay
If I remember
down.
correctly, she didn't.
Stay down, was all he said. There are scorpions, so don't wander. The door shut, leaving her enclosed in hot stillness. She felt the wind buffet the car's side with grains of sand looking through the side window. She saw they already had vanished into the desert night. She huddled on her seat, her heart crying out to God for the horror they were experiencing. She could only imagine what they were doing with the guns near the side of the road. To reject the evil hour and to avoid the reality of violence and death, she closed her eyes and placed her sweating palms over her ears. How long? 4 minutes? 5? Then rapid gunfire crackled through the scorching darkness. She waited for what might have been 10 minutes. David came running toward the vehicle, flinging open the door to the back seat. Well, Brett arrived, supporting Hammond. They hauled him into the back. Hammond had been struck during the gunfire exchange. David tore aside the front of Hammond's shirt. Allison scrambled from the front seat, but Brett caught her arm and turned her around to face him. There's no time. We've got to get out of here. Startled, her eyes rushed to his, but he refused to allow her to search to understand his action. There was no outward apology for his apparent indifference to Hammond. He propelled her back toward her seat. She could feel the thick tension that came between them as vividly as a descending wall. In the starlight, his restrained tension showed in the handsome rugged cut of his jaw and his burning, uncooperative eyes. Allison was appalled. He's your friend, she gritted in a whisper. I need no reminder. Get inside, please. Allison glanced back towards Hammond's silhouette, sweating and gritting against pain, then to Brett. Her indignation slowly stirred to life. He had been willing to leave Jarabelis without David, and though she understood her own life may have been safeguarded by his doing so, she believed Major Brett Holden to be so coolly proficient that he was callous. I won't leave him like that. Do you care if he dies? For only a brief moment, his vulnerability showed, and Allison felt the sting of her remark. She wished she hadn't said it, but his eyes held her steadily. She tried to soften her response as if he didn't understand. This environment is no friend to a wound. You know that, Major. Even a blister can lead to blood poisoning within less than an hour. German German soldiers are still out there, he said flatly. Any light will draw them to us. She understood now, but he turned toward David and said in a toneless voice, Assist Miss Westcott. There's a torch in the back. I'll keep watch. Alarmed, she wanted to cry no, but he took his weapon with him and disappeared back into the darkness. Allison looked after him, then scrambled into the back beside Hammond while David rummaged in the trunk until he located her small medical kit and brought it to her. I'll need 10 minutes, he whispered. David took up one of the guns and went after Brett. She worked with surprisingly steady fingers, trying to remain calm and concentrate on what she was doing, but her mind and heart were divided between Hammond and Brett and David on guard in the darkness between them and any German soldiers concealing themselves near the road. Gunfire crackled again, and her eyes shut briefly. Her eyes shut briefly as sweat broke out on her forehead. Please, God, no. The men returned in a run. Not a word was spoken as Brett backed swiftly toward the narrow main road, swerved onto the hard rock track, and with the headlights out and the vehicle pointing in the direction of Aleppo, pressed on the accelerator, and they sped away. Allison looked toward what she knew was the darkened German car ambushed on the road toward Aleppo. How is he? Asked Brett a minute later. The wound was too high for the lung, she said, surprised her voice was calm. It may have shattered his collarbone. I can't be sure, but there's nothing more I can do now except try to prevent poisoning. I don't have the instruments needed to remove a bullet. He'll need a bed and a doctor, Major, she added. I didn't understand about soldiers still being out there. I wouldn't have... They're all dead now, he said briefly. Hammond's black eyes focused on her, and he tried to say something, but he was too weak. She nodded, soothing his frustration. It's all right, she whispered. We're on our way to Aleppo. David produced a canteen of water, handing it to Allison, who unstopped it and lifted Hammond's head to drink, letting the water dribble drop by drop to his tongue, making certain he could swallow. David then handed it to Brett, who drank thirstily, wiping the sweat from his face onto the back of his now soiled shirt. He was speeding as fast as the vehicle would travel, and no one spoke. Allison, feeling numb, rested Hammond's head on her shoulder and looked ahead where the headlight beams picked up miles of wilderness. David talked in low tones to Brett, but Allison picked up Brett's reply. The sooner we abandon this vehicle, the safer we'll be, and we'll need to separate. We're less likely to draw attention. A car is waiting at the house. You'll take it and go on with Miss Westcott. With the supplies? Asked David. No, not now. It's too risky. She'll be with you. Your bringing the supplies like that wasn't part of the plan. They'll be breathing down your neck. I was to risk it alone. I didn't mind because I believed it believed in it with my soul, but you... David was interrupted by Brett. That's a choice I've decided to make. Let's just say I believe in more than you think. What of Hammond? He'll stand out like a black eye for any on alert. We've been through worse tight spots. I'll take him with me. Once we reach Aleppo, we'll split up. We'll meet in Jerusalem. All right. We won't forget this, Major. Nor will I. We expect a harvest, remember? We'll be there. Her name is Rose Lyman. Lyman? Her brother works under another name for the Turkish officer. It's a perfect setup, Major, and I don't see anything going wrong. Never trust plans to go as well as they look on paper. If anything can go wrong, it will. But if we know that, we won't let it stop us. David leaned back in the seat, and they drove on in silence again. Jerusalem, despite Brett's words that plans usually went awry. She believed he made them with extreme care, that he was a military major who rarely made mistakes, and when he did, she believed they ate at his insides even while he pretended they did not. She wanted to ask him about the guns and ammunition, but she checked herself, believing she had misinterpreted his judgments enough for one night. She wasn't supposed to know that Hammond had mentioned them to Brett back at the expedition hut. It was wiser to keep silent. Had it been part of some plan for David to smuggle them through to Jerusalem beneath the Turkish's noses, a dangerous proposition. But if it were so, what did he expect to do with weapons in Jerusalem? It wasn't lost on Allison that Brett was quite in charge, both willing to change plans and to take the greater personal risk when it appeared necessary. It hadn't been his first plan to deliver the guns himself. Brett appeared callous. Perhaps he was cynical. But how was she to really know? The real Major Brett Holden lived and moved beneath a barricade of callous indifference. Unless he chose to cooperate, there was no way to break through. Perhaps she shouldn't be curious, she warned herself, trying to understand what lay behind that cool and brash exterior could place her at emotional risk. Aleppo was quiet and dark when they arrived, but soon the dawn would break in the east. Had either the Turkish or German authorities near Jarablus wired the officials at Aleppo to be on the lookout? Did the British consul know about one of their own masquerading as Colonel Brett Holman? The British official wouldn't be fast asleep this time of night and was perhaps as innocent as a lamb, or so he could inform the Turkish authorities tomorrow when word arrived of what had happened on the road outside of Jarablus. Brett had informed David that he had silenced the communication line when they attacked the Germans on the road. She wondered what it all meant, yet she wasn't sure she really wanted to know. Involvement with Leia and her death had been tragic and life-changing enough. As they entered Aleppo, Allison considered her situation. It certainly was not without risk, now that she had involved herself with Brett, David, and Hammond in whatever they were trying to accomplish with the guns. She wondered if it had any connection with Leia and Neil's work, or the death of the British agent posing as Major Reuter. Perhaps there was no direct connection. She debated her plans, wondering what they were except for returning safely to Port Said, to wait with her mother for her father's arrival. Sir Marshall would soon be home from his government business with the British Viceroy in India. Allison had her work with Aunt Lydia aboard the Mercy, of course, and it was there, involved in medicine and sharing the message of Christianity, that her heart found its final and true calling. But how could she ever be the same again now that Leia had been murdered? If Major Holden was right and war was inevitable with Germany, what was to be her response? Did she not owe it to Leia to become involved? And what of Cousin Neil? As yet, no one seemed to know where he was. If Brett knew, he wasn't in the mood to tell her. Then there was David and his passion for a homeland in Jerusalem. She had so much to think about, to decide, that she longed for the restful atmosphere of home and the safety and solitude of Port Said residence. Brett maneuvered the motor car down a rather dirty, narrow stone street that Allison believed to be no wider than 7 or 8 feet. At any moment she expected to hear the sides of the car scrape against the clutter of small square houses built on top of each other amid crowded shops. Then the street began to widen into a suck, a square or bazaar crowded with stalls. Brett pulled to a stop beside a fruit stand. It was still dark and relatively quiet, though already some businesses were preparing for the day. The fragrant smell of baking bread filled the air. Several donkeys carrying loads of fruit and vegetables 3 times as wide as their backs trotted down toward the end of the souk, where it narrowed again in 2 jutting stalls. Beggars were there, reserving their favored positions for the new day by sleeping on the spot. She saw a cat prowling and looking up towards roosting pigeons, who in turn looked down with condescension from their vantage points. A dog barked with monotonous yapping, as though it dreaded the prospect of another long day of insufferable heat and flies. Hammond was asleep, and David stirred as Brett turned toward him. "This is where we part," said Brett. He gestured ahead. "Turn left up the street, and Abra will be sleeping in a lift. Tell him I sent you. He speaks English. He'll take you to where the car is kept. You'll find the keys in the courtyard by a door where poppies grow. Don't wait. Drive straight through. Spare petrol is in the trunk." David, in a moment of emotion, clasped Brett's shoulder, and his eyes flashed warm and brown. Without a word, he got out and waited for Allison. She hesitated, her eyes meeting Brett's. They looked at each other, but while she was in the starlight and feared her eyes were luminous and revealing, he was in the shadows of a roofed stall, and she couldn't see his face. "You may need me to help with Hammond. Perhaps I should—" "I have a friend here in Aleppo," he interrupted, a Kurd. "I'll leave Hammond with him. He'll see to Hammond's care until I get back." "Then I suppose this is goodbye," she said. "So it appears. Goodbye." If she expected Major Holden to turn suddenly warm and sentimental, portraying the camaraderie of 2 friends who had been through much together, she was forgetting his emotional detachment. He leaned over and opened the door where she sat. "He's so arrogant," she thought. "I'll see you in Jerusalem," he added when she got out. If there was more to that suggestion than casual inference, she refused it. "I'm not going to Jerusalem, Major," she stated. Whether he knew it or not, she had just made up her mind. She didn't want to lay eyes on him again. "I'm going to the British consul here in Aleppo. I just happen to have some friends there who drove up from the archaeology huts. Goodbye," she added with deliberate indifference. She closed the door, feeling a strain of emotional anger on her face. But she had only taken a few steps in the direction of the shop doorway where David waited in the shadow of the stalls when she heard Brett open his door and get out. In a brief stride, he caught up and intercepted her. "You can't go there," he said in a low voice. "I certainly can and will." He laughed. "You'll need to go home to Cairo by way of Jerusalem, unless I can arrange a boat trip by way of Haifa to Port Said."
That's probably Said.
Her eyes rushed to his, and she was confronted by warm flecks of cobalt blue. "You needn't arrange anything. I'm perfectly capable of arranging my own passage." "I don't see what you're in such a huff about." "I am not in a huff." "Let's not argue," he said with a smile. "I don't have the time. You'll simply do as I ask, please." She paused, calming her pounding heart. Why must I go by way of Jerusalem?" His tone was evasive. "For your safety." "But I don't have the book." "Don't mention that," he cut in quietly. "You're not in position to You're not to mention it to anyone ever, understood? She looked about as though he had alerted her to ghostly shadows hiding behind the stalls listening. You don't think, she began, but he drew her toward the bonnet of the motor car. Your safety may count on amnesia. And yes, I'm thinking of your safety as well as David, Hammond's, mine, and others. Many others. I don't understand, she whispered, searching his deliberately neutral gaze. I know I am asking you to trust me, Allison. It was one of the few times he had spoken her name. The stillness, the hot, smoldering smell of animals and dust and old stone seemed to squeeze off her breath. I do trust you. Would I have told you about Leia if I didn't? But I don't see why I can't avail myself of a comfortable feather bed and a bath at the British consul. I came up with the Blaines. Why shouldn't I go back with them? For a simple reason I can't explain now. It's not General Blaine and his wife I'm worried about, but you mustn't be there tomorrow when the Turkish or German officials show up. They'll be swarming all over the place demanding answers. If they find you there, even if you pretend you know nothing about what happened, they'll learn you were with Leia, if they don't already know. She hadn't thought about that. But if I don't show up and send some explanation to the Blaines, they'll be desperately worried about me. They are family friends, quite trustworthy. I've no reason to argue that. His dark lashes lowered a little. Just do as I say, will you? We're wasting precious time. Every moment we stand here gives an advantage to those who would stop us. Suddenly she felt exhausted, emotionally spent. She was troubled that her presence was putting him at extreme risk. He saw it and took a hold of her arm. I don't want to sound rude, Allison. It's not my intention to harass you, if that's what you think. Seeing you like this is really hard on me. All right, I'll go with David to Jerusalem, she stated. I'll need my bags. They're in the back of your car. A faint flicker showed in his gaze. Then he went to the trunk, opened it, removed her bags, piled them by the stall, and walked to the car door. As their gazes briefly met, his mouth showed a shadow of a smile. Without another exchange between them, he got behind the wheel and closed the door quietly. The next moment, the car pulled away down the narrow stone street and, turned a corner, disappeared. Allison looked after the dusky vehicle, knowing too well it was a marked car as far as German and Turkish intelligence were concerned. Yet he insisted on David driving the second car toward Jerusalem. She felt a pall of uncertainty tighten her heart as she contemplated Brett. She had never met anyone like him before and didn't know whether she wanted to know him better or completely avoid him. She was still standing there, perspiring and miserable, longing for a bath and contemplating the long, arduous journey to Jerusalem, when David gathered up her bags and said in a hurried, low voice, "Come along, Allison, let's get out of here." It was still dark, but dawn was fast on the heels of the fading night. They hurried along the edge of the stalls, aware that life was beginning to stir with the ascending rosy dawn. The street was coming alive with an influx of local Arabs. Several camels came down the street under their loads and headed toward the end of the sharply narrowed street between jutting rows of food stalls. Ragged children played and ate their breakfast of bread, while the adults opened their stalls for the long trading day. "We're to turn left just ahead," said David, and she hurried along beside him, glancing about the bazaar. She was more tired than she had realized, for her kit bag was already getting heavy. David, who was carrying the rest of her bags, shifted them in his hands. They threaded their way out of the packed square and turned down a narrow, rutted street where the sunlight now brazenly struck the dust. "There must be a dozen Arabs with lifts," she said. "How do we know which one?" They hadn't walked far when they neared a section of small houses partially made of mud. "That must be him. He's the only one dozing on a lift. We'll soon find out. Or get trapped trying." Allison hesitated while David approached the Arab and in English offered the name of Brett Holden. The man was wide awake. Perhaps he had been all along. He climbed down from the wooden wagon-like contraption, calling to her, "Hello, and good morning." David tossed the bags into the back, and the Arab went around to the front to drive the donkeys. Allison stepped out to sit on the edge of the lift, and David jumped onto the back. As the donkeys trotted away, their hooves raising powdery tan dust, they arrived where the car was located more quickly than she had expected, and she looked about curiously, uncertain where they were. An outer courtyard showed little life at the back gate where they had stopped. At first glance, the gate didn't seem to lead anywhere. She wondered at the stifling heat, which was already trapped within the high, whitewashed walls. An odor of chickens and goats permeated the air. Then she saw it, parked in some morning indigo shade, a small motor car. The Arab left them, and David went quickly to the hiding place, retrieving the keys near the wall where the poppies grew in profusion. It was a stylish little car, British, she supposed. She wondered to whom it might belong. Brett? Did he have a house in Aleppo? And the next minute they were in the car with the engine running smoothly. David looked at her with a grin. "This week in Jerusalem," he said.
In Jerusalem, that sounds, but you don't know.
No, I don't know. What is it?
Well, there's a saying that